There we go. Let's get the recording started again and let's jump right back into the next topic. So now we're going to talk a little bit about evaluation, and our speaker for today is going to be Dr. Alexis Grant. And Dr. Alexis Grant does evaluation all day, every day. So this is her full-time work. She also brings experience in community engagement, using different methods and thinking about equity when we talk about evaluation. So in addition to doing this as her full-time job, she is also the recent founder of Beyond Today Solutions, whose goal is to equip organizations like yours to think about maximum impact in their work. She's also a recent grad from the University of Illinois at Chicago. So I'm going to pass it over to her to get us started today.
Thanks, Maggie. So hi, everyone. It's good to see you and see your pictures. I have a lot to cover today in our next 2 hours. So I'll start with like a little bit of a roadmap to get everyone oriented to what we're going to go over today. So I'm going to start with really an overview of evaluation, why we do evaluation, different types of evaluation and approaches, to really kind of give everyone a foundation of what do we mean when we talk about evaluation, and what are the expectations that funders might have, or even other organizations we work with when we talk about doing evaluation together. And then we're going to talk about creating and using logic models, which are a really helpful tool for planning evaluation, as well as generally program planning, and can also be really helpful for starting to fill in what goes into the narrative for a proposal. So we'll do a breakout activity related to that, and then we'll probably take a short break, and then spend some time actually looking at an RFP and practicing a little bit what we talked about, and learning how to read an RFP for key terms related to evaluation and monitoring, so that in your narrative and in your application, you can make sure that what you've written kind of aligns with expectations from the funder. So next slide, please. So evaluation, I love this little comic, because I think for all of us, we want to show that our programs have an impact, right? So there's a person here asking, hi, I donated $20 last year. Can you tell me how many children I've saved? And so anyone who's run a program and has done the budgeting, this is a kind of a complicated question to answer sometimes, because it's not $20 goes to one kid or two kids. It's an investment into the whole program and everything that's happening. So when we do evaluation, it's really a way to show what kind of outcomes come from the investments that are put into the program. Go to the next slide. So evaluation, going to the core of its definition, is an assessment using systematic data collection and analysis of one or more programs, policies, and organizations intended to assess their effectiveness and efficiency. So going back to impact, there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about impact or think about impact. But evaluation as a whole is really looking at like, what is the merit or what is the worth of all the activities, all of the inputs, all the investments that we've been doing in our organization or in our program. And so evaluation really wants to get to the core of examining and describing and making judgments about the product, making judgments about how people were actually impacted by the program or the policy. So evaluation is very context specific. So any evaluation is going to be really tailored to the organization, to the program, because that's how you really show whether or not it worked. And evaluations intended to be used by stakeholders. So when we talk about stakeholders, it can be the funders, it could be the program participants, it could be the program staff, it could be the board. So there's a lot of different ways that evaluation can be used, and that will kind of inform what the evaluation would look like. So why do we evaluate? Why do we talk about evaluation? The really obvious point is that it's required by funders. In a lot of RFPs, there's some kind of expectation to demonstrate impact or demonstrate that you've been doing the requirements that they've outlined. And to do that, we need to have some kind of system to keep track of how many people were served, maybe what programs they participated in, how funds were allocated. So evaluation is really the way that we are able to do that. Evaluation is also really helpful for improving program design and implementation. So rather than doing evaluation just at the end of a program or whenever the funders require it, it can also be a helpful process for really refining what's happening in the program, and then also figuring out like what's working, what isn't working, and why, and what can we change. Those are evaluative questions. And then of course, evaluation demonstrates program impact. So even if it is required, it's really helpful to design evaluation in a way that you can use later for maybe a future proposal, a future grant opportunity. So if you can point to a previous funding opportunity you had and be able to say how many people you served, maybe where in the city they were from, how many staff members you had, how many hours of services you had, all of that information can be really helpful when you're trying to sell your program or sell your product to a new funder. So I have an example here on the slide of from an RFP taken from the City of Chicago's e-procurement portal, which I think Robin shared a little bit about earlier. And so this is kind of, I'm just going to read this off and point out where evaluation would fit into this. So this is from the general invitation section, so right at the top of the RFP. And it says that they will provide funding to one community-based organization to conduct outreach and provide information on labor rights and protections to vulnerable populations, focusing on low-wage workers and emphasizing reaching workers who reside in neighborhoods as defined by the city recommended opportunity zone tracts, which have the highest rates of poverty as designed by the IRS qualified census tracts. And the selected CBO will screen workers for city labor violations related to paid sick leave, minimum wage, scheduling, wage theft, domestic worker rights to a contract, bodily autonomy, anti-retaliation. If alleged violations are reported, the CBO will help the workers file a complaint with the Office of Labor Standards. And for federal and state labor violations, the CBO will make referrals to the appropriate government agency with jurisdiction. So there's a lot there, right? So even in the description of the services that the city is asking for, there's a couple of points where evaluation can be helpful. So one is that in this, they're asking for the organization to conduct outreach and provide information on labor rights and protections to vulnerable populations. So that by itself, there's a couple of questions that you might want to look at in a program if you are going to apply for something like this. So one is like, what kind of outreach do you do? What kind of methods do you use for outreach that specifically reach vulnerable populations? And what evidence do you have to show that you're effective at doing that? Providing information on labor rights and protections. So in the latter part of the description here, it actually lists out different rights and protections. So it would be really helpful to be able to have access to your program information to actually be able to give account or a detailed description of the different information, the resources that your organization already has and has experience developing. And then also this specifically talks about opportunity zone tracts, kind of relating also to the vulnerable populations. So having information about the people or the areas that are served by your organization can be really important for strengthening your application for something like this. And then also your organization will screen workers. So if your organization has data about having a screening program or some kind of system for that, then having that data would be really helpful. You can go to the next slide. So when we look at the reporting and evaluation requirements for this particular opportunity, it outlines that the grantee will be required to track a range of metrics using the BACP mandated platforms and will report on targets outlined as above and defined in the executed contract. So there's the clear phrasing that there's some kind of expectation that the organization will be tracking some sort of metrics, and those metrics will be agreed upon by the organization as well as BACP. So a portion of these will be measured against preset agency targets. So some of those are going to be things set by the funder in this case, as part of the contractual obligation. And then others will be collected for information gathering purposes for the city. So there'll be another set of metrics. And then an important component of that report will be the evidence that the grantee referred cases for complaints and or submitted complaints on behalf of the worker. So that's something really important to keep in mind if you're responding to this opportunity in your narrative, thinking about examples of referring clients to a formal system can be really helpful when showing that your organization has the capacity or the system required to meet the reporting and evaluation requirements. So when it comes to the application, it's helpful to think about evaluation, not just in showing that you can meet the reporting requirements, but also as a way to think about how you can be really strategic in showing your organization's capacity for doing the work outline as well as for reporting effectively and really showing evidence for the way that your organization does something. So when you align it, one question is, what specific knowledge and experiences do you have in terms of reaching out to the low wage and vulnerable workers? So that was clearly a very explicit call in that RFP. So if you have data from your program, that would be really helpful in strengthening your application and demonstrating that you're able to reach the population. And then when you're thinking about what is in the proposal, if you're going to be building out portions of an existing program or starting a new program, you can be really thoughtful in making sure that the focus of the project aligns really well with what's being asked. So by thinking about how you're going to ensure that you outreach to the neighborhoods that were defined, if your organization has experience with that, you can integrate that into the proposal. And then having a plan to refer the complaints as it outlined, if your organization has a system for that or an idea for a system for that, that's helpful to integrate into the application. And then also ensure that your organization is able to actually monitor if those complaints get filed and then what happens after that point. So program and evaluation are best when they're integrated, and you can click on Maggie. There's an image here that's a circle of continuous program improvement. So it has evaluate, what are we doing well or poorly, planning, what do we want to do, implement, how do we do it, and then measure and monitor, how are we doing? And it's a circle. So even if evaluation isn't required by the funder, or maybe the requirement is not very strict, maybe it's easy, evaluation can really be helpful in creating a better plan for your program and for your organization, and really taking advantage of all of the information you have from participants in the program, from the staff who implement the program, and really trying to learn as you go and make it better and more efficient. So I think of program and evaluation as most effective and most efficient when they're integrated, rather than doing the program and then doing evaluation after the fact. So this is kind of a summary slide. So we have evaluation can be used as informational, which is something we see a lot of times in this area, is that we want the evaluation to be able to understand more about the program, to meet those requirements by the funders, maybe to inform decisions about the program or the policy, guide improvements, and then build knowledge on what's actually happening in the program. Evaluation can also have another use and impact specifically on building capacity. So it can be something that actually strengthens your organization as a whole once people are part of this continuous improvement process. It's also an opportunity to empower stakeholders. So if you are maybe teaching your staff how to do different evaluation activities, maybe creating a survey to send to clients, that's something that is a skill that then your staff can actually take with them into other aspects of their lives. And then there's also an aspect of evaluation for advancing equity and social justice. And that's with specific forms of evaluation. If you are integrating people that you are serving actually into the process of evaluation, that's an opportunity for their voices to be elevated and heard. And so there's different ways you can design an evaluation to be more inclusive and be an opportunity for people to learn, grow, and advocate for broader changes outside the program. So you can click on for the whole slide to show up. So there are different phases and types of evaluation. We're going to go through everything on this slide kind of one by one. So when it comes to evaluation, there's going to be different things you want to know, and there's also going to be a timeline for when you want to know those things. So if you're just starting with evaluation, you might start with a needs assessment to figure out what really needs to be addressed in that area, and that's sometimes called a formative evaluation. A process evaluation, which is kind of in the middle of that diagram there, is the type that most people are familiar with and the most common, especially with funding opportunities. That's really focused on what's happening in the moment, what's happening with the program. And so sometimes that's referred to as monitoring or tracking. And then outcome and impact evaluations fall into this summative category. And that typically comes towards the end or after a program is over to look at if the program did what it said it would do in terms of its impact or its outcomes. And then if there are any unintended outcomes. You go to the next slide. So thinking about when the evaluation will fit into the timeline for this project or program, we have the formative and the summative. So the formative is early in the process, and its real purpose is to guide changes and identify improvements as you go. So a formative evaluation is really going to inform what can we fix kind of more immediately going forward. And so that type of evaluation, typically the audience is going to be the program personnel, so people who are implementing the program. Versus a summative evaluation might be something like once you have a funding opportunity, they want you to submit an annual report. And in that report, you're going to summarize what happened in the program, what kind of outcomes you saw in the participants. And so it's going to satisfy the compliance and showing that the funds were used the way they said they were, as well as inform future decisions and kind of informing whether or not this funding was effective in whatever outcome was outlined. And so summative typically happens at the end of a program cycle or a designated milestone. So it might be something like annually every year. If it's a 2-year grant, it might be just after the 2 years. And then typically for a summative evaluation, the audience is going to be broader. So it could be decision makers at the organization, it could be program leaders, it could be funders. So aligning with the timeline for the evaluation, there's also the types of evaluation. So the needs assessment, again, at the beginning. So that's really focused on what is the problem, what needs exist, really describing that and then trying to find out ways or identifying recommendations to address that issue. And then a process evaluation is going to specifically look at the program and how it operates, how it achieves its outcomes. So a process evaluation might look at something like, is the training that we've given to our employees effective for them to do their job? Is the system that we have for communicating with clients working? And then the outcome evaluation is going to specifically look at the changes that occur in the program beneficiaries. So the participants of the program, people who attend the program as a result of their participation. And then the impact evaluation is going to look at program effectiveness in achieving the ultimate goals. So within the funding opportunities, the process evaluation is a very common type of evaluation that is asked for. And part of it is really focused on like what actually happens during implementation. So when an RFP is put out, the contract is signed, there's these expectations that the grantee is going to be doing the work outlined in the contract. And so to monitor that, they might be doing something like keeping track of the type of services provided, the number of people served, the number of activities, the number of meetings. And they're also going to pay attention to how much money the project costs, how that money is being used in terms of staffing, supplies, any other resources that are required to do the activities outlined. And then the other common one, you can go to the next slide, that you will see and ask for is the outcome evaluation. Because a lot of funders want to see that there is an impact in their funding efforts, right? That their money was not a waste. So they'll want to know about the program services. So a little bit about who was served, what kind of services they received, but then also what were the changes. So they might be curious about knowledge or awareness, attitudes, beliefs, changes in the environment, in behaviors, in disease trends. So having that kind of data about the recipients of the program can be really helpful in showing that the money was well spent. So something that's important to think about as you plan for evaluation, or even just think about evaluation and where it fits into your workflow, is thinking about what resources you have in your organization to do evaluation. So there's internal and external evaluation as an option. So internal evaluation is conducted by employees of the program or the organization. So it might be you, it might be someone else on your staff, someone who's familiar with the program and the context. So a benefit of this is that that person can understand what's going on. They understand all the moving pieces. But sometimes this can be something, a little bit of a barrier to having a really robust evaluation, because that person can be very close to the objective. They might be really close with the participants, and that can affect how they respond to a survey, for example. And then it might not be financially independent. So if your funding is dependent on certain outcomes, then that could be considered potential conflict of interest, and the outcomes that the evaluation shows are kind of tied up with the money. And so an external evaluation is an option where someone from outside of the organization will come in to conduct the evaluation. So they're a little more distant from the program, they're financially independent from the outcomes, as well as a lot of external evaluators have a specific skill and expertise. So if you want something like being able to map where your clients come from all over the city, that might not be a specific skill that someone in your organization has, but an external evaluator might have that skill and be able to offer something a little different than what you might get from an internal evaluation. Some cons to that is that sometimes it's difficult to come in and learn the context of the program, and so some things can get lost. There's potential conflicts of interest for repeated business. So if an external evaluator is evaluating the program over a long period of time, they kind of lose that benefit of the distance from the program. And then external evaluation is, of course, a little more expensive than doing it internally, because you're not just paying for that person's time, you're also paying for some of the resources that they're using to do the evaluation. So when you're deciding whether or not to do internal or external evaluation, it really depends on the budget, the timeline, and the expertise and capacity. So with the budget, the external evaluator is going to be a little more expensive, and also it's going to take time to hire them. So with some, depending on how the contract is laid out, when you actually apply for the opportunity, you might have to describe or submit the resume if you are planning to hire an external evaluator. So that's something to keep in mind if you plan to hire an external evaluator, to make sure to look out for that in the opportunity, to make sure that you don't have to get have that included in your application. In some cases, it's fine to add that on later or submit that information later. And then also with the timeline, another consideration is if you are using your existing staff, depending on what kind of evaluation activities you want to do, it might take up more of that staff person's time. So if you want a really robust evaluation and maybe you do have the budget, it might make sense to have an external evaluator who can dedicate days at a time to work on the evaluation, or even to turn around things like surveys or focus groups. They can turn those around quickly because their whole job is just to do that evaluation. And then also you want to think about the expertise and capacity. So what kind of expertise your staff have. If you want to build that expertise internally, that is an option. There are different resources for people to learn how to develop surveys and facilitate focus groups and do data analysis. And so that's something that you can choose to invest in for people in your organizations, or that's something that you can turn to an external evaluator for. Okay, so when you're thinking about an evaluation, you want to think about the purpose, the user, and the use. So why is the evaluation being conducted? Who wants this information? And what are they interested in? And then how will they use that information? And so these three questions will be really helpful in making sure that the scope of whatever you're proposing is not too big. I think in an ideal world, we would have a lot of money and we'd be able to do this really intense study to show that like our program works and this is how I know. But unfortunately, making those kinds of claims takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of people. And it's not really feasible when we're, that's like secondary to what we're really trying to do. And so it's really important to set a focus with evaluation and be really focused on what are the outcomes I need to know and who is it for. So you can go to the next slide. We have a scenario here, and feel free to engage in the chat or come off mute. So we'll say that you're doing a evaluation 1 year into your program to train community health workers. Another community wants to adopt your program model, but they want to know what they're in for. So thinking about kind of the content we've talked about already, does anyone have thoughts to what is the purpose of the evaluation? What is the type of this evaluation?
Okay, I'll say something. Evaluation of your program is key. I would say the purpose is to not only be able to understand what's going on internally within your organization and the status of like your personnel, understanding of the mission and the implementation of the mission, but also to measure your impact in the community and see if it's aligned with your goals that you really planned on accomplishing.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. Any other thoughts?
A thought would be quantity, how many people being impacted, and quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you're a program hoping to replicate what someone else is doing, you want to know how exactly do you serve this many people? And what kind of services are you doing? So this is a description of what would be a process evaluation. So this person is interested in knowing what they're in for. So what is the process? How many staff did you have to hire for this? How much time do they take to do the different elements of this program? What kind of resources did you have to invest in? And so for an evaluation like this, you might really focus in on looking internally at the organization, what's happening with the staff, what kind of systems you have in place so that everything runs smoothly, or maybe doesn't run smoothly. What have you learned? So for this type of evaluation, I'd be curious to get folks' thoughts. What do you think it should be, internal or external evaluation?
I think it could be both, but I think it would be most beneficial if it's internal. Or I'm sorry, external.
Okay, I see someone in the chat put internal. So we got a debate here, internal. I see another one. Internal, okay. So yeah, I see Vera Rose Smith said it could be either, depending on resources, but internal. Yeah, I think if this was my organization, I would probably start with internal, especially with a process evaluation where you might be really just talking to the staff of the program. It can be really helpful for someone who already has that established relationship with the staff and already understands the different parts of the program to be kind of the lead in collecting all that information about the program. Now, if you have a funding source where you're able to do other kind of data collection activities, maybe a little more formal, something like a document review, you could have someone go through all of the meeting notes for all the meeting notes for all the planners of this program and keep track of how they've actually been able to make changes in the program, road bumps they've had along the way. So that would be kind of a different kind of activity that maybe an external evaluator would have more resources and time to do. So thanks everyone for engaging. So I have another example on the next slide. So say that you received a 2-year grant to implement a job readiness program and the grant funding is ending. So the funder wants a complete description of how the funding was used. So based on what we've learned so far, what is the purpose of this evaluation? Who are the users? What is it being used for? And would you make it internal or external? See someone in the chat put internal. Internal. External with accounting services. External, okay. Yeah, so depending on the resources, I think you can go either way with having this be internal or external. So this evaluation, they want a complete description of how the funding was used. So the intended user is going to be the funder for this. So they'll be really interested in what are the inputs. So what did you use that funding for? So you might want to show things like how many staff people were hired, if you hired new staff for the program, or maybe you paid for a percentage of their time with the funds. If you used any of the funds for facilities, for any program materials. And then if you did use it for specifically program materials, you would want to show how many individual people benefited from those materials. So say you used funding to purchase, to help partially purchase a building or rent out space in a building. you would want to be able to demonstrate how many people were able to attend whatever services you housed there. And so because the funder is really concerned with their investment, they're going to want to see what kind of outcomes came from that investment. So this will be a summative evaluation, and it would specifically be an outcomes evaluation. And so they might also want to see something like what kind of changes you saw in the clients that you serve. So in the job readiness program, you might want to show something like 70% of our clients had a job within a month of enrollment or something like that. And that would show a pretty positive outcome for the program. And I think the funder would be pleased with something like that. So now we're going to kind of shift a little bit to logic models. So something that's really helpful for responding to an RFP and also for the first step evaluation is really just taking a step back and describing your program. So within that, we have inputs, which are the resources that are required to implement the program, your activities that are done to develop that program, product, or service, your outputs, which is the amount of services that are delivered to make that change for those outcomes, which is the change the participants are expected to see. And that can be broken out into short, intermediate, and long terms. So when you describe the program, we're going to talk about logic models. I like to think of that as something really helpful to kind of serve as a roadmap of how you describe what is happening in the program, what do you need to make the program operate, and what are the different elements that make it successful. So a logic model is a graphic depiction of the relationship between your program's inputs, activities, and then its intended effects and outcomes. So it's really helpful for showing this if-then relationship among the program elements. So you could show that with this funding, you want to hire 3 new staff members. And with those 3 new staff members, they're going to implement a series of workshops. And with those workshops, maybe we'll say 300 people will attend and they will be more equipped to get hired. And then we'll have outcomes that 70% got a job after attending this workshop. So the logic model can be really helpful in laying out that relationship and then also making sure that there's clarity and consensus about the main strategies, the activities, and the intended outcomes. So logic models are really helpful even outside of the scope of evaluation. It's helpful when you have maybe new people come into the organization. And it really gives a bird's eye view of all the different pieces that are working together to make an impact in the program. So you don't need a logic model, but you always need a program description. So when you jump into program planning or evaluation planning, it's always really helpful to be on the same page about what need your program addresses. What is the goal? You want to be on the same page about who is the target groups. Who needs to take action, because that's going to inform why you do things a certain way. It's going to describe the kinds of actions you need to take, which are the intended outcomes. And it's going to describe the activities to meet those outcomes. And then the relationships between the activities and outcomes. So why it actually works. So having all of these things laid out can be really helpful for describing your program. And it could be something like a narrative, but we're going to talk about logic models because it's a really neat way to have everything together and really boil down to the key parts. So the logic model includes these 5, these big buckets here. So we have the inputs, the activities, the outputs, the short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. So the 6 areas. And then all of that is going to be informed by the context and the assumptions. So things like, why are we serving this community? What languages do they speak? What's the history of programs like this in the community? All of those things are going to inform what you do and why you do it and why you're doing it a certain way. So with the inputs, you can click Maggie. Okay, so with the inputs, it's really focused on what the program needs. So what do we need to function? The activities is going to be focused on what the program does. So the activities are going to be like staff members are going to spend time to create workshops. And then the outputs are going to be something like, we're going to do 5 workshop sessions. And then the outcomes are focused on who or what will change because of the program's efforts. So this is really the so what to your program or the work of your organization. And so with a logic model, sometimes can feel like it could get a little complex because we have a lot of things going on. And in general, we want to avoid a messy map like this because part of the benefit of the logic model is that it's going to be a clean, easy representation of the main idea of what's happening in the program. So if you have multiple components of a program, sometimes it's helpful to have a logic model for just one component and break that all down, rather than having a single logic model that captures portions A, B, C, D of the program, and then there's 20 branches off of each of those. But you also don't want to go too simple with it, where this comic here says, give us money, we all win. At the end of the day, it's really important to show what's happening on the in-between with that arrow. What do you do with that money? How does it all work? So you can go to the next slide. So with the logic model, it's really helpful to think about what's the program and its staff, what do we do, and then who or what will change. So in our workshop materials, you can go to the next slide. I have a logic model template that I've provided you with, and you can take it with you. And I'll just describe what's in it. And then we're going to do a little bit of work with it. So with the logic model, you have the inputs, activities, outputs, and then your outcomes/impact. So in our breakout rooms, you'll use the inputs column to list the monetary and the capacity resources that'll be used in the project. So this can include things like actual money. It can include things like space, actual locations of programming. It can include things like people that you have to coordinate with, staff people that you're going to use or hire. The activities is going to be focused on the specific services or programming. The outputs are going to be focused on the direct result of the project's activities. So sometimes it's going to be a little difficult to delineate the outputs or the outcomes, but think of the outputs as attendance in the program. Okay, so maybe you have 30 youth who are going to attend your after school program for a year, and that's your output. And then your expected outcomes or impact. Again, these can be broken into short term, medium term, and long term. So say short term, if you have an after school program, you want your short term outcome to be something like a positive environment for enrichment in their community can be a short term outcome. And then maybe a long term outcome could be something like creating a culture of mentorship in the community. So not necessarily something that you might see in this short funding opportunity or in a year even. A long-term outcome is going to be speaking more to the overall goal of what is the impact over time that you're expecting to see if this program continues and can make in the participants' lives. So when you are creating a logic model, you can identify activities and outcomes to a couple different ways. So you can pull from things that you already have written, like program descriptions, missions, visions. That can be a really helpful starting point for getting some of the content on there. Another process that can be helpful is reverse mapping, which is starting with the how-to. So starting at the beginning part of that logic model with the activities and the inputs. You can also do forward mapping that starts with the activities and then asks the so what to generate the outcomes. So going forward. And so with that, you want to make sure that whichever like sequence you decide to do, that you're covering everything before you move on to the next step. And it can be helpful to sometimes arrange things in a time sequence. So what comes first, what comes second, what comes third, and that can be helpful for making sure that something doesn't get left out in the process. Another option for logic models is creating arrows in between different activities and outputs if there are specific activities that are only going to contribute to specific outputs. And then of course, the logic model can be reviewed and it can be refined. I think the most refined logic models go through a couple of revisions before they're really nailed down. So creating a logic model can be a really helpful process sometimes to do with the staff in your organization. Once you have an initial draft, it can be helpful to have everyone think about what's happening in our work. What are the outcomes that we see? Is what we see aligning to what we've planned? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And so that can lead to maybe needing to update the narrative of what is the work you're doing? What's the impact that you're having? Okay. So with some sequencing with the logic model, you want to typically have the activities in order and then also the outcomes in order. So if you have something like an after school program, first step is going to be recruitment, right? And maybe even before that could be establishing relationships with the schools. So say you have those activities, you want to have those in order in your logic model so that when someone is able to take a look at it, again, it's a wide view of what's happening in the program. They're able to see the different components in order and also see how everything kind of feeds into the next step. So it can be helpful in showing that even if an outsider might think that your program is doing a bunch of unrelated things, it gives you an opportunity to outline it in an order that makes sense to you. And then you have a visual tool to help explain that. And then similar with outcomes, which outcomes have to occur before the other outcomes occur. So again, staying with this logical order. So when we get to the output section of the logic model, you can go to the next slide. So say you have a program that you're going to public events in the community and screening children for lead poisoning. So maybe in your outputs, you have these different metrics to keep track of what is actually coming out of this intervention we've created. So you might have something to talk about your outreach. So there'll be a set of activities related to that. And your output could be the number of eligible kids who could be screened. And then you might have an output related to screening, and that could be the number of children that were actually screened. You could have an output for referrals. So of those children screened, how many were referred to medical treatment? And then you can also have an output for something, if you had a family element, the number of families that were trained. And so all of these different outputs would align with different parts of the program. And you would be able to see the investment in the inputs, those resources, all the way leading to the outputs and what you can actually show to funders. And you can go to the next slide. I always like to push organizations to think about upgrading their outputs a little bit beyond just the counts. In thinking about, okay, which children will likely meet that risk profile? What is the number of clients trained using culturally competent curriculum with appropriate supports? So all that sounds better to funders, right? the number of referrals to qualified medical treatment providers. So thinking about this element of intentionality with the way that we describe our outputs and our outcomes can be something helpful. So if in your program with the referrals, for instance, say that you had your staff actually vetting the different medical providers that you had on your referral list, that would be something really helpful to potentially have in your output section of your logic model and of your program narrative, to add in that descriptor of like qualified medical treatment providers or vetted medical treatment providers, and showing that you are very, very specific and intentional with what kind of outputs you want. And so with your outcomes, you want to make sure that your goals are SMART goals, which I'm sure many of us have heard of before, of being specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So especially if you have a specific funding opportunity you're applying to, your short-term outcomes, you're going to want to describe what kind of outcome you're expecting to see in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years, having an element of time to that. And then being reasonable with what kind of change you are expecting, and making sure that whatever measure you're going to be using is relevant to the goal of the program in the first place. So with that overview of logic models, we're going to move to our first breakout activity. Before I do that, I want to pause for questions, if that's okay, because I know I went over a lot. Okay, we can keep going. Okay, so I'll explain our workout. So in the Google Drive folder, there's a file named Breakout Activity 3 and 4. And so go ahead and download that. We're going to go into breakout rooms. So in that document, there's a short paragraph of an intervention for childhood lead poisoning prevention. And in that, there's a couple of worksheets for you all to go through and pull out the activities, the outcomes, to sequence those activities, and then really start to put together your own logic model for that make-believe program. That definitely has a real one like it. So in your breakout groups, there are some discussion questions and in those worksheets, and I think Goody's gonna send everyone to breakouts, and I will float around rooms for about 15 minutes.
I'm giving everybody that extra 30 seconds to download or open the drive so you can grab the files. And if you can't access it, let us know before I open the rooms. Also, you're going into the same breakout rooms, so I hope you have started to make some friends and some networks. How long? Oh, actually, nope, that's everybody.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good time in the breakout rooms. I know probably you didn't get to the end of it, but that's okay. The answers are in that document. So if you want to spend more time with it, you're welcome to do that. We're just going to go through kind of an overview of what I think you might have gotten out of it. And then we'll wrap up by looking at an RFP. So go to the next slide. So I had you go through that lead poisoning intervention example. And so some of the things that you might have come up with for the activities were things like outreach, screening, identifying kids with elevated blood levels, lead levels, excuse me. referral for medication and treatment, environmental assessments, family training, and some of the effects of those activities were that the lead source would be identified, families would adopt in-home techniques, providers would treat the elevated lead levels, and then the housing authority would eliminate the lead source. So thinking about worksheet number 2, I can go to the next slide. So outlining the activities as well as the outcomes in the order. So we kind of talked about that a little bit. So the early activities like outreach, screening, identifying elevated lead levels, and then starting the case management process were all things in that early activities category. And then the later activities were things like the environmental assessment, referrals, training for the family, and then those activities would lead to some of those short-term and more long-term, intermediate-term outcomes. So with the early outcomes, you would have the lead source identified, that source removed, the adoption of in-home techniques, and any children with the elevated blood lead levels would be getting medical treatment. And then overall goals of this whole entire program is to reduce elevated lead levels, stopping the developmental slide, which is what happens with that exposure. And then overall long-term goal, improving quality of life. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind for a logic model is that arrows can help. And so I'm gonna show one on this slide here as an example, as something that could be helpful in describing how everything fits together. So the arrows can go from activities to other activities. It can go to activities to outcomes. It can even go from like the short-term effects to the long-term effects. And this can be really helpful if you have multiple components in a program. So with this logic model here on the slide is an example of maybe something that could be created for the example that we saw. So with the activities, we already put those in order on the worksheet. So we have that in order where one arrow is reaching to the other, which makes sense for this program because the outreach is going to be able to have a pool of children or families to screen. And then by doing that screening, they'll be able to identify kids with elevated lead levels. And then those kids will be put into case management. And then we have that going into those different activities. And then we can see that specifically for the environmental assessment, they will do a referral for cleanup if there's some kind of toxic exposure or lead source in the home, and that will lead to the lead source being removed. And so this can be really helpful for programs that have multiple things going on all at once, or maybe different types of interventions depending on the client or depending on certain criteria. So this can be helpful, again, giving that bird's eye view of all the different things happening in a program. And also showing how everything's related to each other. And then all of these outcomes are contributing to the same long-term outcomes. So it's telling that story of how these things actually fit together, even though referring to medical treatment and training families might not seem like the same activity that fits together. You can go to the next slide. So kind of a summary with the logic models is that they take time to make. I know we only had like 20 minutes in our breakout groups and we were just getting started. And that is totally normal for logic models. So if you're going to spend time investing in creating this roadmap for your program, it's really helpful to make it something that will be used by you. And it's kind of helpful to think about it as not something that's necessarily worth it as ends in themselves. Like if your goal is just to create a logic model so you have one on file, that process won't be as fun as it could be. But think about all the different ways that you could use a logic model for evaluation, the ways that you can use it for clarifying with stakeholders for having that roadmap to your program that you can use to explain to funders. You can use it to explain to people within your program or even other programs to be able to tell that story coherently. And I have a little summary slide here. So logic model can guide the evaluation planning, can monitor your program implementation. So if you're doing something like a process evaluation, you can go back to your logic model and make sure that you have make sure your survey addresses all of the different components in your activities column, for instance. It can also be helpful for showing accountability. So if you have your SMART goals or your SMARTY goals, thanks Goody for putting that in the chat. You can actually have accountability for looking at, okay, here's our goal of how many people we want to serve or how many sessions we wanted to have. And having that written down can be really helpful for having that accountability and also going back to figure out if we didn't meet that output goal, what happened there. So it can be helpful for continuous program improvement and then increasing the knowledge base for your program and how it works, and ultimately the outcomes that you're going to see. So here's an example also taken from the Chicago's e-procurement portal for this 2-year Spring Forward program. So it's a reentry, employment, and housing navigation pilot program. And its goals are to address the negative economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on residents returning from Cook County Jail or the Illinois Department of Corrections by providing reentry, employment, and housing navigation services to facilitate access to affordable permanent housing, wraparound supportive services, and connections to job training and employment placement programs to stabilize returning residents and mitigate the risk of recidivism. So we're gonna take a look at this a little more closely. And I think we were originally planning for a breakout, but our group has dwindled a little bit. So let's just stay in the big room. So in your Google folder, you can open up a clean copy of your worksheet if you don't have it open already. If you have it open already, I've basically created this section already in the worksheet, so you can just scroll down. And at the top of it, it'll have the same exercise that was on our previous slide there. So it's a description of this Spring Forward program is what it's called. And so with the rest of our time, we're going to go through and kind of do this logic model together, but starting with this RFP rather than starting with the program. So I'll give folks a second to open up everything. And I guess if you can give a thumbs up or put something in the chat, if you have the RFP open. Okay, I see some thumbs up. Great. Okay. So we can do this all together. So what we're going to do is go through the first 2 worksheets. So similar to that other activity, but we're doing it kind of in a reverse order. So using this RFP, and so in the box folder, you have the drive folder, excuse me. Breakout activity number 4, RFP is the name of the file. You can go ahead and open that up. And that's the full RFP for the Spring Forward program that was put out by the city. So let's take a look together at what is in this. And I wonder.
I was gonna say, do you want to share the? Or do you want me to-
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Like, let me make sure I don't mess it up. All right. So I'm going to share the screen with the RFP. Can everyone see that? I'm scrolling.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, great. want to make sure I was doing the right screen here. Okay. So let's take a look at this RFP, and I have my workshop 1 open here. And so I guess, can I get a like show of hands or something in the chat? Have folks looked at the RFPs on the Chicago e-procurement portal and how they're organized? Oh, it's always hard to put in the chat. Yes. Okay, see yes here. Okay. Okay. So within the RFP, it'll have usually a detailed description of the expectations of the program or whatever it is that they want to fund. And then also within that, they'll typically have a detailed expectation of what kind of outputs or metrics or monitoring they expect. So if we look at our worksheet 1, the first question is, what will the program and its staff actually do? So typically on page, oops. So big. Let me make sure I have it all here. Okay, let me actually pause my screen share for a second and make sure I have everything up properly. Okay. So I think I have the page numbers here incorrect, so I apologize for that, everyone. Okay. So at the bottom of the RFP is the full description. So I got a little lost there. I'll share again. Okay. So in the section 1, we have the purpose and the scope of services. So within this, we're going to look and see what is the program and what is the staff. So taking a look at this, feel free to shout out or put in the chat. What is the expectations of the services that will be delivered with this RFP? And I know this might be tiny on your screen, so feel free to click out if you need to. I'm going to scroll down to the program description here. Okay. So I'll give folks a second to respond. Feel free to shout it out. Okay. So some things in this RFP, they describe employment, housing navigation, and re-entry services. So those 3 main buckets right there in what is expected of the organization or organizations who will deliver these services. So something also that is helpful to keep an eye out for in some of RFPs is if there's going to be a separate RFP for a different part of the work. So this says that there's another proposal for reentry employment navigation, and then a separate one for housing navigation. And that respondents can apply to both RFPs. So say that you read the goal of this RFP and you agree with the outcomes, but maybe your organization doesn't do the activities. Paying attention to what other opportunities could be from the same funder is something helpful to keep in mind if you believe in the outcomes of a program or funding opportunity, but maybe the activities don't align. Okay. So with this program, they also have a very specific list of outreach and recruitment activities, intake screening and assessment activities, referral activities, and navigation services, and related to the job training as well. So within that, if you're creating a logic model for your program, and maybe this is something that you want to apply to, kind of following the lead of the funder can be really helpful in making sure that the way that you describe your program is going to resonate with the people scoring the proposal. So kind of thinking about like working backwards with these listed activities, it can be helpful to list out the activities that are outlined by the funder and seeing how that aligns with the activities in your organization. And then also, as much as you're able to and as much as it fits, making sure that in your narrative and in your description of your own program, you're hitting on all of these different categories. So with the outcomes, we have the question on the worksheet here of what changes do we hope will result in someone or something other than the program or its staff. So some different places you can look for this in an RFP are the purpose, which is at the top of the description here. I'll try not to scroll too fast to give people a headache. So all the way at the top of the introduction of this RFP, it talks about the purpose of it. So they want to address the negative impacts, economic impacts of COVID-19 on residents returning from Cook County Jail or the Illinois Department of Corrections. So that's the overall goal. And then other places you might see this in an RFP are going to be in the program background, which we saw on page 5, in terms of what they wanted to see with the clients served by these programs. And then, as typical with a lot of RFPs, they have the performance measures, which in this case is going to be further down on page 9 here. So with the performance measures, section E, they have really specific ones. So they have this expectations that any organization who's applying for this RFP is going to be able to not just meet these benchmarks, but also be able to measure these benchmarks. So that, so an organization will be able to tell them what % of participants will enroll in the program and will complete the program, what % will receive an industry recognized credential, what % will be placed in employment, what % will meet the retention benchmarks, and what % will earn their wages. So in order to have this kind of data, it indicates that you're going to need to have intake data from all the clients, as well as post-program data for the clients, because you want to know if they are placed in employment. You're going to want to know up to 180 days retention benchmarks in the unsubsidized employment. So that means following them for a certain amount of time, as well as being able to have some kind of information about what are their wages when they do have employment. And then also within that, they have a specific way that they expect for you to collect this data. So they outline that there should be an intake assessment. There should be at least 105 people enrolled that become employed and retain that employment. And then also they have an expectation of how many people will meet that 30-day benchmark and at what minimum wage proportion. So looking at the goals of this specific funding opportunity, as well as what they're asking, it can be really helpful to take a look at worksheet number 4, which we don't need to all fill out together, but it's kind of a tool I came up with to be kind of an aid for reading these RFPs and aligning that with how you talk about your organization and why you think your organization is equipped to do the work that's outlined. So I'll drag over my Word document here. Okay. So looking at the application, by knowing what the target number served in the population, you can talk about the capacity of your organization to serve that many people. You can talk about your experience recruiting or serving the population that's outlined. By paying attention to the amount and the term of funding, you can talk about how your organization has managed a similar amount of funding before, if they've worked with a similar timeline before. And then also with the 30-day, the 60-day, the 180-day follow-ups, if you have examples from your organization doing that previously, or showing your organization has resources to do that, can be something that strengthens your application. And then looking at how often there is an expectation for reporting can be helpful in demonstrating your staffing and your systems, and the resources you have to collect data, or the training that your staff already have to be able to turn around surveys quickly, for instance. And then also paying attention to what information that you are expected to report regularly. And then again, what resources and what format you have for collecting that can be something that is helpful in your application specifically, because you're showing the funder that you have a plan. You don't need months to plan out the system for how you're going to do this. You have staff that are already trained, you have staff that are experienced with Google Forms or Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, whatever format or platform you're using. Showing that your staff are comfortable with that process can be helpful. And then making sure that if there are specific performance indicators that are set by the funder, being sure to discuss somewhere in your narrative or in your application how you're going to track progress towards those indicators. And then lastly, if there's an expectation for you to propose additional indicators. So some funders in their RFP, they will say, if they invite potential grantees to have their own metrics that they want to measure, that's something that you can take advantage of. So that's something to think about, especially if you want to do something like continuous program improvement. You could at intake ask clients something like, what kind of format is best for you for workshops. So even though the workshops are already planned at that point, that might be some kind of useful information for improving the program in the future, or creating more opportunities for more people to engage in the program. So it's an opportunity for you to take the opportunity, if you're already creating a survey, to think about what you can gain and what you want to learn about your program or the people that you serve. So with that, I'll stop sharing and I'll pause for questions. Okay, I'll keep going. I have like 4 slides. Maggie or Goody, whoever's sharing, can you start at slide 81? Okay. So just to wrap up, we're going to talk, or the next slide actually. I'm going to talk what's next. So when you're reading an RFP, thinking about these questions, it's always really helpful to identify any questions that you have for the funder. So say for something like, maybe it doesn't say if they want grantees to have additional indicators and you really want to integrate that, it can be really helpful for you to submit questions to the funder. So a lot of these opportunities will have a window for questions, and it might just be a week or 2 weeks. It's typically pretty short. And then it might be a couple days or a week to turn around the answers to the questions. So reading the RFP carefully before you start working on it is going to be really helpful for identifying those questions and making sure that your application is as strong as it can be given the information that you have. And then once you have a closer read, you can think about your own evaluation questions. And then if they want you to be specific, you can talk about your indicators. So what are the actual things that you'll be measuring? How are you going to measure that? Is it going to be something like a survey, or maybe you'll do a focus group? What does that look like? And then if you're actually doing the evaluation, you'll collect your data, you'll analyze it, and then you'll draw the conclusions and results, and hopefully turn those into action to make your program better, or provide evidence for future funding. So the later steps are informed by all of the work that you do in the earlier steps. So evaluation can really be about anything. You can focus on a specific part of the logic model. You can be on all parts of the logic model. But going back to the evaluation purpose of what is the evaluation for, who is it for, and how will they use it, can be really helpful in identifying what is the data you should collect and how should you analyze it and report it. So the evaluation questions can deal with the boxes in the logic model. They can deal with the arrows in the logic model. So if you get to a point where you're actually creating evaluation questions, you'll want to make sure that they are aligned with everything that you've already planned out. So we have the appropriate questions that are aligned with the purpose and the context, answerable questions that you can actually answer with the data, timely questions that fit with the time frame. So something like a after-school program is going to be really difficult to collect information about the impact that it has 3 years from now, because tracking people down after 3 years is not easy. Informative evaluation questions. So you want something that provides insight, not necessarily something that you know the answer to. And then also evaluative. So questions that will help you determine merit or worth. So a question can be a yes question, no question, or to what extent kind of question. And then my last slide here is something for you all to take with you if you want to spend more time thinking about like examples of how you might be able to come up with evaluation questions. I've put on the slide a couple different scenarios to play around with and think about what kind of evaluation questions you might come up with for some of these examples. So I think for now, I'll pause and we can do questions. So now we're almost out of time.
I don't have a question, but I would comment that this has been an excellent session for me. The breakouts were valuable in applying what had been taught. And I'm just pleased that I was able to sit through the entire 4 hours.
It's a lot. It's a big lift. So thank you. Okay. Well, I'll just add that as someone who does evaluation all day, every day, having a logic model is the best thing for an external evaluator. Because a lot of the times we were working with deadlines and sometimes getting the whole contract thing can take up some of the time that is really valuable for evaluation. So I encourage you to work on your logic models as much as you have time for and as much as you have planned out. It can be really helpful, not just for you, but for anyone else who's going to come in and work with you.
All right, with those last words of wisdom, could we pause for a moment and give a round of applause to our guest speaker? Thank you, Dr. Grant. There's lots of love for you in the chat, talking about how folks got a lot out of your session. So thank you. Let's send some emojis and some round of applause to Dr. Grant for her session today. So we know we're almost at the hour. We just have a few last things that we want to share with you. So we're going to bring up this calendar of events one last time. So if you thought today was useful and you want to attend more workshops or other webinars, please sign up. These are all of the events that are coming up in the next month. And if you feel like you need more one-on-one assistance, you can also schedule some time to get some consultation specifically about your organization and where you're at. So here's the website, chicago.gov/BACP recovery plan. And that's where you can sign up and find the schedule of events where we'll be announcing everything. And with that, we want to thank you. Thank you all especially for making it to the end of these last 4 hours, which is a lot of time, but we hope this was meaningful to you all. We will be sharing the slides and recordings so you can go back and look at this, but we also want your feedback. So if you could pull up your phones and scan this QR code or click on the link that we're going to drop in the chat. Please take about 5 minutes. Let us know what was helpful today and what we can improve for next time. So let us know what you want to see and we'll design the sessions that you all are asking for. And we'll circle back to you and let you know the dates and times for those. So I think the surveys in the chat, please go ahead and open it. We're going to give folks a couple minutes to click on it and complete it. So we'll leave the room open for just a couple more minutes. But other than that, that's all we have for you today. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Grant, for being here. And thank you all of you for leaning in and really participating over the last 4 hours. So round of applause to everyone. We hope folks have a great day. We're going to leave the room open. Just if you want to complete the post assessment, we'll be here for a few more minutes. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie and Goody.